Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining our panel on driving progress on energy and climate policy. I'm Norman Bay, a class of 82, co-chair of the Energy and Commodities Group at Wilkie, Farr, and Gallagher, as well as former chair of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, otherwise known as FERC. Based on records over the last 140 years, the 6 hottest years on record have been the last 6. Australia had what they're calling their Black Summer last year. And in the United States, closer to home, much of California seemed to be ablaze in August. Texas went through what they're calling Winter Storm Uri just a few months ago. And scientists have found that greenhouse gas emissions reached 409.8 parts per million in 2020. According to NOAA, that represents the highest levels on Earth over the last 800,000 years. So there's an urgent need for change, all of which raises the question of what policies would help us drive progress in both energy and climate policy. Joining me today for this very important conversation is a very distinguished panel. We have Congresswoman Annie Kuster, class of 78, United States Representative for the 2nd District in New Hampshire, which includes Hanover, New Hampshire. Phil Giudice, Tuck class of 85, Special Advisor to President Biden on climate policy. Toby Schmidt, Head Energy Politics Group, ETH Zurich, and Marsden Hanna, Google, where he heads up sustainability and climate policy. So we plan to save 10 to 15 minutes for a Q&A period. So if you have questions you'd like to ask our presenters, please submit them using Zoom and use the upvote feature if you'd like to make sure that the questions that seem to be the most interesting to the audience are the ones that are asked. So with that, without any further ado, let's get started. In the United States, more carbon emissions are coming from the transportation space than from the power industry, roughly 28% to 27%. Figures in the EU are similar, though they're reversed. Although we've been making progress in the energy space, how can we continue to make even more progress? And then how do we leverage any progress from the power industry to other sectors of the economy? So let's start with a discussion on electricity. In 2019 in the United States, about 38% of the electricity was carbon-free. The Biden administration's goal is to have 0 emissions coming from the power industry by 2035, what's sometimes known as the 0 by 35 goal. So what policies will help get us there? What policies will help us decarbonize the grid? If you had to list the top 3 policies, what would they be and why? So Phil, why don't we start with you for a perspective from the administration?
Great, Norm, thank you. And I'm glad to be with my fellow panelists and with all of you. The power sector has been undergoing pretty remarkable transition over the recent decades. As it has moved to much higher levels of coal-fired generation to much lower levels of coal-fired generation. And so the path that we're on is pretty remarkable that we've gotten to this sort of 40% carbon-free at this stage. The challenge is going to be keep everything that is carbon-free now and accelerate the addition of more carbon-free resources. In the not distant past, we have dealt with very difficult climate challenges and emissions challenges and worried about them in various mechanisms. One was acid rain about 25 years ago now. We put in place an interesting policy that enabled moving much lower acid rain emissions by all kinds of innovation from the private sector. And I think that there's enormous opportunity to sort of learn from some of these successes that we've had in the past and continue to kind of accelerate that progress. So I'm pretty optimistic about it. It's going to take leadership at all levels. And I'm really glad that we have a president that is so committed and an entire administration that is so committed to take this challenge on and move forward. But it's going to be the private sector. It's going to be all of us working on this together. And so I don't have any magic few policies. I kind of want to work on all of the important and knowable technologies that we have right now, get them deployed at a much larger level, much quicker as I think we can. And then continue to invest as we are substantially in research and development to continue to bring out better technologies for the future. That's a thumbnail. I look forward to digging in further.
Thank you, Phil. Marsden, Google has been front and center in trying to drive decarbonization in its own power usage. And so you clearly have been following the space very closely as a company. What policies from a Google perspective can really help us reach that next level where we go from 40% to 100%?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much for the opportunity to be here and really excited to join the discussion. So I think, Norman, as you said, we've been focused on clean energy and decarbonization for a very long time. We've been carbon neutral since 2007. We began purchasing renewable energy for our operations in 2010, and we scaled that up dramatically over the subsequent decade to reach our 100% renewable energy goal in 2017. We've maintained that every year since. And we've now done clean energy purchases on 4 continents in many states. And we've got a good sense of some of the policies that work best for getting to a zero carbon grid or approaching a zero carbon grid. I think a couple that come to mind are clean energy standards. We've seen now, certainly in the US, there are several dozen states that have a variation of a clean energy standard or a renewable portfolio standard. These have been instrumental in helping set the guideposts for decarbonization of the power sector. They've done a lot, but we have a patchwork now, and getting to the administration's goal of 100% zero carbon grid by 2035 is a very ambitious and very exciting goal. But it does mean accelerating the pace of deployment to 4 times the historical rate. So to get to that level of acceleration, a clean energy standard is going to be an important piece of that. Additionally, it's really critical that be a technology neutral and technology agnostic approach. Wind and solar can take us very far, and we should continue to invest in them. But opening that technology aperture to every carbon-free technology is really a key piece. Beyond that, I'd say competitive electricity markets. We've seen that large liquid regional markets where any buyer can transact with a willing seller are really instrumental in helping bring on clean energy resources and help save consumers money. We've seen in MISO that customers are saving over $3 billion a year simply by having an integrated regional 14-state market. In SPP, customers are saving $3.5 billion. And not only do these have the potential to help save customers money, they can help bring on zero carbon resources. We've seen PJM's grid intensity drop by 30% over the last 10 years, largely as a result of a competitive market signal that allows lower carbon and lower cost resources to come online. And I think a recent study showed that if you were to introduce something like this in the US Southeast, you could reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 37% and save customers hundreds of billions of dollars over a period of 20 years. So there's really a lot of potential from these kinds of open market systems. And the last thing I'll say is just transmission build out. There's a very clear link between the presence of inter-regional transmission and achieving the lowest cost zero carbon resources on the grid. So that's something I think that we think is really important to focus on.
Thanks, Marsden. So I have here from your list, clean energy standards that are technology neutral, competitive markets, and transmission. Not forgetting the fact, in other words, that you need to get that electricity to the load centers that can use it. Great. Toby, what about the EU perspective? What policies do you think would be helpful in the EU in terms of reaching a carbon neutral future?
Yeah, thanks first of all for the invitation. I'm very happy to contribute a bit of a European perspective because we're also, of course, undergoing the same transition and we're facing similar problems. Some of the problems are different, and some of the problems are maybe a bit solved already. So for instance, we have a very good transmission grid. It will need further built out, but compared to the US, I think it's in a better state, and that actually is very helpful. You can already observe this, how this enables higher shares of renewables throughout the continent. So that's I would definitely agree with Marsden on that one. One thing we use in Europe a lot are renewable energy auctions, and they're really going through the roof. And they really come in at extremely low bids. So we have extremely low cost for renewables now. This has the reason that this is often contracts for differences. So where the price is kind of fixed, when the wholesale price is higher, you have to pay. When the wholesale price is lower, you're compensated. So you have fixed revenues essentially, and banks love this, and pension funds love this, and therefore they provide capital at very low cost, which is really essential for capital intensive renewables. So that's another policy that works well. And some people say, hey, we should just trust the EU emissions trading system. We have, as you might know, we have a system like that in place, which now actually has reasonably high carbon prices. So we're above 40 euros per ton now, roughly $50 US, $60 US sometimes. But I'm skeptical, because then you bring in the investor risk, and that means the investor will not finance renewables at this low cost. So that might be a bit tricky. Another comment I want to make is on what Marsden said about tech neutrality. I agree that we need a portfolio of technologies. I fully agree with that one, but I'm not sure whether policies themselves need to be technology neutral, because if they had been technology neutral in the past, for instance, if there were no dedicated solar policies, solar would still, I don't know if anybody would have bought down that learning curve of solar, right? It was just 15 years ago, it was the most expensive way of producing electricity. Now it's, in many geographies, it's the cheapest, at least on a pure LCOE basis. So I agree with the portfolio approach, but sometimes you need to, give those technologies different support depending on the cost level that they're at in the beginning. And that's something we did a lot in Europe, and thereby also helped PV bring out of the niche.
Thank you, Toby. Marsden, how do you respond to that comment that, maybe having policies that aren't completely technology neutral is a good thing?
I think of it as a push and a pull approach. So from a clean energy standard, when you're looking at requirements around mandates for the ultimate carbon intensity of a grid, we want to denominate that in our ultimate goal, which is zero carbon. It's not necessarily technology A or B. At the same time, I think there's a really important role for incentives and incentive mechanisms, like those that have been deployed very successfully in Europe and in other markets, to help bring on, help make those technologies more cost effective and incentivize them. So completely agree. That's been totally instrumental in the past. I think now the sector is at a point where, as Toby said, renewable energy, wind and solar are some of the most cost-effective resources out there. And so I think there's a question now as to whether we should continue to have incentive programs that are only focused on those technologies versus incentivizing all carbon-free technologies. We're seeing in the US, other carbon-free technologies like nuclear have challenges competing in the marketplace, and their zero carbon attributes are not valued. So how do we incentivize and value those attributes, I think, is important.
But to be clear, I do think that that's exactly the direction that we're going in terms of continuing to support specific technologies, some of which are mature that need to continue to get better. Even solar and wind is examples of that, and special dedicated programs of support to push R&D and deployment in the right ways in there, as well as storage. But also looking at a very generic or agnostic clean energy standard that might be applicable at a national level, that will be tailored to different states or regions depending on how it comes through the legislative process. And that would then say, all carbon-free electricity is equivalent from that standpoint. So the technologies might get different support, but the requirements in terms of getting to zero carbon would be applied, across the board.
Thank you, Phil. And speaking of the legislative process and legislative outcomes, we have Congresswoman Annie Kuster here. She had some business in the House, but happily for us, she was able to join us. So welcome, Annie. And so the question is, and this is one that you've been spending a lot of time thinking about, I know, energy and climate policies, and maybe the energy policies that could help us bridge the gap from where we are now to a zero carbon future in the power industry.
Sure. Well, great to be with you, Norman and Marsden and Toby and Phil, and my sincere apologies. I have had this commitment on the books for a long, long time, but you'll appreciate the irony that it was my turn to speak in our House Energy Subcommittee and the House Energy and Commerce Committee on the hearing entitled The Clean Future Act, Driving Decarbonization of the Transportation Sector. So it seemed appropriate. One area, and I know you've talked about quite a few, wind and solar and nuclear, but I think if you take into account three buckets, maintaining what we have for clean energy, expanding, developing new clean energy sources, and then improving efficiency, one area that I'm focused in is sort of straddles the first two, and that's hydropower, a clean energy source that is carbon free. And right now we're getting about 7% of our energy from hydro. But recently, and I'm sure you all heard about this or read about it in the New York Times, another Dartmouth alum, Dan Riker, class of 1978, who's involved in this event this week, was involved in the negotiation of a major agreement between the hydro producers and the environmentalists, the river conservationists. And we refer to it as the 3 R's: to rehabilitate, retrofit, and remove dams. And it's something that we're talking to the administration. I've recently spoken to the Secretary of Energy, to the head of the EPA, and others about how we can include this. But New Hampshire, right along the Connecticut River, has a number of important dams, but the average age is 88 years old. And so I put that out there as yet one more example, sometimes overlooked, but hoping to get it included in the big infrastructure package that we have coming.
Great, thank you. So to what extent, as we think about decarbonizing the grid, do we have the necessary tools in the toolkit? And to what extent do we need to rely upon innovation? And so I'd be very interested to hear the panel's perspective on that question, because currently there's a little bit of a debate going on between some people who are saying, look, forget the next shiny new object. Let's just kind of use what we've got and kind of see how far that takes us while we continue to build innovation or create innovation. And others are saying, no, what you really need is just a kind of a massive push on innovation. So what's your take on all of that? Who wants to start off our discussion here? Phil, go ahead, go for it.
Yeah, I'm glad to go. I'm very much in that former camp. I think there's an enormous untapped opportunity of technology that's we already know is cost effective. It does have challenges, and we got to deal with those, and it's got to be done on a site specific, situation specific, wind and solar particularly. We also know that there's an interesting technologies that are not ready yet from a commercial economic standpoint, but are certainly ready from a technology standpoint. Things like electrolyzers to make hydrogen, and if it's cheap enough of an electrolyzer and the electricity that is powering it is cheap enough, it can be green hydrogen. And that has enormous opportunities, both from an industrial standpoint and transportation standpoint, potentially. I mean, the details to be worked out, but it's not like we have to invent a new technology. This is nothing like the vaccine invention that happened over the last year, which was truly remarkable of a scientific achievement. This is really much more of an engineering challenge and an economic challenge of getting into the right price point. And then carbon sequestration and is another possibility that it has not been tested at the levels and demonstrated at the levels that's necessary, but there's a lot of technology that's already right on the shelf. And oh, by the way, it'd be great to continue to be investing in new technologies like packaged nuclear plants or other types of technologies that might come upon us. But if we're at the 40% sort of clean energy electricity level right now in the US, I have no doubt that with just even wind, solar, and transmission upgrades, we could easily be at the 75 or 80+% levels. And hydro revamping as well, to the degree that that makes good economic and environmental sense. It's sort of, there's a lot of available technology that simply hasn't been deployed at the levels that we need it to. And so we can be doing that as we're getting ready for that last 10 or 15 or 20% that we also know we need to get to zero carbon.
Well, thanks, Phil. I see a lot of heads of panelists kind of nodding up and down in agreement with you, but let's get other perspectives here. Marsden, what's your take on this? After all, you work for a company that's, you know, in the heart of Silicon Valley.
Yeah, no, I agree entirely with everything Phil said. So I'm actually going to take a slightly different approach and talk about another opportunity here, which I think is the role of digital technologies and IT in helping enable this transition. So as we move on to into a world where there's more intermittent variable resources coming onto the grid, you have more consumers installing electric vehicles and solar panels on their rooftops. You have simply more complexity in the system in terms of supply and demand. And this is something that is increasingly challenging for grid operators to manage. So to address this, we announced actually, I shouldn't say we, our Alphabet company X announced which is a slightly separate company from Google, announced a moonshot for the grid as part of President Biden's Climate Leaders Summit several weeks ago. And our hypothesis with this is that if we can create a single virtualized view of the grid, this is something that can really help accelerate this transition. So currently, everybody who interacts with the grid, whether they're building, managing, or regulating power, is using a different set of tools and a different set of models. That worked really well 50 to 100 years ago when there was a much more streamlined system. But now we have billions of devices coming online. It's very challenging to manage a grid of this nature. So this is where we think tools like machine learning, artificial intelligence, and advanced computing can really make a big difference. We've seen this over the last decade that these kinds of virtual representations of the real world environment can be super efficient ways to manage and predict what's going to happen. So we're still very early in this work, but some of the questions that we're exploring when we think about how to achieve this are, is it really possible to create a virtualization of the electric grid that's so detailed that every actor can understand this in a way that works for them? Second, can we forecast the weather so that we can enable better integration of wind and solar resources at different points on the grid? Third, can we use this kind of technology to rapidly simulate what might happen in the future, whether that's 10 minutes from now, an hour from now, a year, or 10 years from now, and use that information to help inform systems decisions? So we're very early in this work still, but we're excited to dig in, and I think this is a technology that can really play a big role.
All right, thanks, Marsden. Annie, what about your perspective in terms of, whether we need more tools in the toolkit, or, whether we've got the right tools and, we just kind of need to use those tools while we continue to develop innovation?
I think I'm with Phil, some of each. And what Marsden's just talking about, actually in this hearing, Marsden, we were talking about electric vehicles and the data that they can produce and that can be taken into account as to the level of usage and that information flowing to the grid, which is really interesting. You also reminded me, my younger son went to Tuck, Thayer for the engineering school. He's a Dartmouth undergrad and then Thayer, and he has a new company that he created that's about melting ice off of buildings and bridges. But what's interesting is it's now going to be the Internet of Things, where it's connected to to the data about the weather, and they've done the switching and all this. So I think you're right talking about that's where we're headed in the future. I wanted to just mention two. One, we were just talking about on the hearing about transportation, effective battery storage. And not only do we need innovation, but we need, I believe, and this is something I'd pitch to the Biden people, is to bring those jobs home to the US and to try to reach a price point where it makes sense. And also just in terms of the international, posture, is we're relying on China for so much of those rare minerals. And in fact, some of those minerals are available here. We just haven't invested in getting those. But then the other one, and this is somewhat controversial, I know, in the field, because there are people who don't want this excuse, but carbon dioxide removal technology, I think it shouldn't be left out of the discussion. If we're genuinely talking about zero carbon emissions and decarbonization, realistically, if we're going to decarbonize what's out there, we have to look at this removal technology. And I have a bill, and it's actually bipartisan, to create a 10-year whole of government approach for research, development, demonstration of carbon dioxide removal technology called the CREATE Act. So I'm a fan of new technologies, but I also agree that with Phil's assessment, we've got a lot out there that we're currently not making the best use of. And our role, particularly working with the new administration, is to align the incentives so that, public-private partnership here, that the private sector makes the right decision, that the investors make the right decision to move us toward decarbonization.
Great, thank you, Annie. Toby, a view from the EU.
Yeah, I fully agree with all that's been said. I also think first of all, we don't have the time to wait for this miraculous technology that will solve everything. Maybe we'll have fusion at some point, but we've been waiting quite a while. And that's not against putting, research money into that. That's not what I'm saying, but we're just running out of time. So we need to be faster, we need to deploy. And the second reason is, when we think about innovation, we often think about the radical innovation, completely new technology, completely new approach, but we should also value a bit the incremental innovation that adds up. And if we deploy this technology, we'll get better at producing it even more. We'll get better at designing it because we get feedback from the field. Think about wind turbines from 20, 30 years ago. These were really not the wind turbines that we're building now. I don't know, GE has this 13 megawatt giant. So this was, and I know NASA and others tried to build, megawatt scale wind turbines in the 80s, and they failed. But it was this incremental learning that helped, scaling up these turbines, and that's another reason for also deploying. That said, I agree that there's and that, by the way, this also applies to batteries, right? I mean, batteries have come down dramatically in their cost, and just maybe a European perspective on that also. So that aspect of bringing the battery industry, the cell manufacturing industry, also to Europe, that's a big topic also in Europe, because it's, of course, one of the biggest industries of Europe is the car industry. 4 million jobs in Europe are dependent on the car industry. And now this shift to electric vehicles is just, from a geopolitical and industrial policy perspective, is just so important. The good thing is the EU has acted the last few years, so there was a lot of movement forward. So you have the European Battery Alliance, and actually we do see a lot of factories now being built in Europe by Asian suppliers, but also now by the first European consortium. So there is a lot of movement. And I think there's also great research, by the way, that shows how manufacturing a good in your home market can help you to make a better product. So it's also product innovation that by better understanding how to manufacture something, you can also design the product better.
Well, and imagine all the energy we use shipping these products all over the world back to where the markets are. You reminded me with the incremental growth in new innovation and ideas about offshore wind. And New England is about to make a major step in offshore wind that could just be a game changer for us here in terms of our reliance on carbon energy. So I think I'm excited about that. The construction is starting and we're hoping to get that online. And then the last thing is that you reminded me of in terms of incremental, I'm thinking of the Nest and that, you know, that's the, again, Internet of Things, but just being able to control the energy in your home when you're not home. In New Hampshire, those of you from Dartmouth will remember this, the cold winters, people just used to leave the heat on all day long. They went off to work, they went off to school, nobody was in the house, but they didn't want to come home to a cold house. Or they would leave the heat on, you know, in a weekend house that they weren't even in. And now, what people do is, you know, if they're driving up Friday afternoon, evening to go off skiing, then they turn the heat up so that it's nice when they walk in the door. Or if they go off to work, they can turn the heat down. So this incremental technology, I think, can make a really big difference.
All great points. You know, when you look at even the existing technologies, there are 2 regional transmission organization markets that have reached about 80% penetration of renewables at any point in time. So that kind of goes to Phil's point that even using existing technologies, we can pretty substantially decarbonize the grid. And the challenge is going to be closing that, you know, 20% gap or so at some point. And I was taking notes of the suggestions from all of you, and this is what I heard: green hydrogen, carbon capture and sequestration, carbon removal, advanced battery technologies, digitalization, and which would also combine machine learning, cloud computing, and the like, and advanced nuclear, if that can be developed, whether it's SMR or something, a small modular reactor or something else. But in the meantime, you know,
there's others that could be added to that list. I think that, you know, deep geothermal is another area that's, you know, very interesting, you know, engineering wise. And so there's a lot of potential resources to bring to bear, but there's also a huge challenge in ramping up what we already know can move us far down the field.
Yeah,
and energy efficiency. Don't forget that if we just make homes so much more efficient, energy savings, I think, you know, we've come a long way, but every generation of children that we educate about our planet and climate and energy use and energy efficiency. I got a letter from my 8-year-old great niece on the virtues of recycling this week, and that was very impressive and quite well written and advocated. So I think changing attitudes is also going to be a part of this, and we've got to stick with it. We can't. I was very interested in this hearing. My Republican colleagues, every time they spoke, they would preface it by saying, well, of course, we're going to be moving into the electric vehicle you know, industry, but, and that we've come a long way. If we had done this hearing a few years ago, they wouldn't have had that preface in it.
Yeah, and, you know, I think your point about offshore wind is a great one, Annie, because, you know, as that industry really took off in the EU and now it's coming to the US, and as it scales up, costs are really coming down to the point where it's not completely cost competitive with onshore wind, but who knows, at some point it perhaps could get there. Toby, you were going to make a comment.
Yeah, I just wanted to also reinforce that energy efficiency opportunity that we have. It's just enormous, and it's not easy to change people's, and behavior is just one aspect of that, right? There's also some other issues with it. It's often, you know, very small scale. Every little house is not, you know, like building one nuclear power station. Then you have achieved much more in a big way. But I think what's really interesting is to think about technological change and behavioral change in combination. And I think if we think about the way we travel today, right? Nobody has, you know, we have everything in our little tablet or our phone, and then we fly somewhere, and then we're like, oh, what's my hotel's name? Oh, I have to Google, I have to check it on my email, right? We're behaving completely differently, right? And I think the digitalization can really help us change our behavior in a way that we are much more energy efficient.
Yeah,
Well,
you
and
know,
the objectives too. I think about that a lot in terms of the household. And you're right, how many billion households, but people can make decisions. If they were incentivized, they can do their laundry at 10 o'clock at night. They don't have to do it in the middle of the day. I mean, I think we're missing a huge opportunity. And you're right, it's the technology and the behavior that go hand in hand.
yeah, I have to say that I think one of the very exciting developments in demand response is aggregated demand reductions enabled by smart meters and digitalization. If you get a few 100,000 homes in a major metropolitan area deciding to dial back their energy usage during a really hot summer day, that can make just a huge difference to the grid. And so clearly energy efficiency is part of that story, but it's enabled by the digitalization.
There's a Dartmouth and Tuck connection to the early demand response innovators, which was a company called Enernoc that two Tuck alums. I served on the board and I was an investor, and it was all about harnessing the internet to be able to turn down demand at commercial industrial facilities on call, and got priced the equivalent of the most recent generation edition. So it was the alternative to building out a gas-fired peaking plant, and it made tons of economic sense. Became a public company and later got acquired by Enel, and there's still enormous opportunity to tap into the demand side and get more efficiency and get more flexible load to be able to respond to the variable renewable energy that's going to be a more significant part of the mix. So there's lots and lots of interesting opportunities out there.
Yeah, just to chime in from our side, I think we couldn't agree more. And I like Toby's framing around technological change and behavioral change. We announced a commitment last fall to help 1 billion people live more sustainably through our core products like Search and Gmail and Maps. And we're still really in the early phases of this, but we think there's a lot of opportunity. We announced a couple of weeks ago that Google Maps, when you're trying to get from point A to point B, is now going to default to the least carbon intensive route. So we're helping people nudge through very simple methods to reduce their carbon footprint through transport. We're also going to be showing them many more options for lower carbon modes of travel. So if biking is very popular in your city, you'll see more opportunities for getting from point A to point B on a bike, or whatever you're using public transit or whatever the mode may be. So we couldn't agree more that there's a lot of opportunity for behavior change. On the technology front, completely agree that efficiency is a huge opportunity. We've spent a lot of time because we operate a fleet of 20 data centers around the world, which are very large electricity consumers. We spent a lot of time focusing on energy efficiency for our facilities, and we spent many years optimizing the design of the building and the operations of the building to be as energy efficient as possible. And we a couple of years ago decided to actually put artificial intelligence in control of the building, and told it to optimize for energy efficiency. And immediately when we did that, we got a 30% energy reduction on electricity used for cooling, even after many years of operating at twice the industry standard of efficiency. So we think that kind of technology has really tremendous applications for decarbonizing the industrial sector, helping commercial buildings, industrial facilities, aggregating many different commercial buildings and other kinds of facilities together. So lots of opportunity in that space.
So it sounds like we can all see a path forward from the power industry. And indeed, studies show that carbon emissions from the power industry were down 32% from 2005 levels in 2019. So the transition to renewables, the transition from coal to gas, all of that cumulatively has made a difference. And so we can see a path forward in the energy space. But what do we do about the other sectors of the economy? As I mentioned earlier, 28% of carbon emissions come from transportation, 27% from the power industry. Industry accounts for 22%, commercial and industrial 12%, and agriculture 10%. So how do we take the progress that's happening in the power space and leverage it through the rest of the economy. Anybody have thoughts on that?
Yes.
We'll let Phil go first. He'll set the table. We've got a good thing going here.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's a really pretty straightforward set of equations, and there are some that are right away exciting, which is electrification of transportation, in particular, light vehicle transportation. Yes, it's going to require massive investments. It's going to disrupt a lot of things, but I think it will also create enormous opportunities. An internal combustion engine car takes 30% more man hours or person hour, labor hours to build than an electric vehicle. But boy, if we start integrating into building our own batteries in the US, which we have 3 significant companies doing, and the opportunity to grow a lot more, we can grow new industries on the basis of that. Charging stations will need to be built out. All of that is certainly directly in line with the administration's priorities, and lots of folks that see this as a good idea. It's going to require behavioral change at the customer level to say, yeah, I really kind of like these vehicles, and I'll be going with them. And we'll see there'll be winners and losers in terms of the OEMs that are marketing to them. I think next year, maybe it's the year after, the most popular vehicle in the US will have an electric only option, which is the Ford F-150 pickup. And that's kind of exciting to be seeing. So that's one whole demand side of emissions that I think could, all the technologies in hand to really dramatically change that. And hopefully we'll see that happen. GM committed to being only electric vehicles at some point. I can't remember how many years out it is, but in the not distant future. So I'm really comfortable with that. There are other challenges. I mean, heating in particular in the colder climates, moving to air source heat pumps or ground source heat pumps is clearly a viable technology. It may not be as cost effective as we start getting down to the below 0 type Fahrenheit temperatures that we sometimes get around these areas. But I've got no doubt that there will be more innovation that will come to bear. And then in the industrial side, glass, steel, cement, big, heavy industrial, there's lots of possibilities. They're not ready yet, and we don't have the demand yet for greener commodities in those fields, but I don't think it's over the horizon. It's really just a question of getting it up and running and making the commercial case for it. So I do have lots of enthusiasm around the power sector, but it does continue through the rest of the carbon challenge that we're facing. It's not that we're going to get there. It's not going to be easy. It's going to be messy. But I think there's lots of opportunity to move down the curve and get to a 0 carbon economy and have a stronger economy as a result of all of this.
Thanks, Phil. Annie.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in because I know ag comes up in terms of agriculture and the impact on carbon. And we had a great meeting, a shout out for Phil with Secretary Vilsack and our committee. I'm on energy and commerce. No good deed goes unpunished. I've gone back on ag, primarily around growing food closer to where people are eating it. That's part of the energy problem, is that people drive the food all the way across the country. And here we are in New Hampshire in beautiful rural communities, and people don't get food nearby. But also because of this carbon issue with ag. And I think one of the things that Secretary Vilsack talked to us about was a USDA-backed carbon bank that they're looking at, and also what can we encourage people in terms of carbon sequestration, cover crops. We've certainly had good success here for USDA grants for solar on top of barns and roofs. And so I think we've got legislation called the Agriculture Resilience Act to get the ag sector to net 0 emissions by 2040. So that's something we're working on as well.
All right, Marsden and Toby, any thoughts you want to share on this question of how you decarbonize other sectors of the economy?
Sure. Yeah, happy to go. Yeah. So I think another sector that's, or I shouldn't call it a sector, but maybe a jurisdiction that's really important to focus on is cities. how do we get cities to decarbonize transport systems and take advantage of opportunities to reduce emissions from buildings and really to clean electricity, provide clean electricity for residents. We've partnered with the Global Covenant of Mayors, which is an aggregation of many thousands of cities around the world. And there's hundreds of cities that have set a goal to achieve a certain level of decarbonization or zero carbon emissions, but only about 20% of those cities have actually put together a plan and have a pathway to doing so. And one of the first barriers they have is just simply getting good information about emissions in their city. So one thing we've partnered with the Global Covenant of Mayors on is bringing a tool we have called the Environmental Insights Explorer, which aggregates information about transportation emissions, solar rooftop potential, building emissions, and in some cities, air quality, and makes all of that information available at a municipal-wide level to a city planner. And they can use that to help understand their own emissions. Doing this manually is often very expensive and very time-consuming. And we have this data in an aggregated and very anonymized way that's available for city policymakers. And then they can use it to do scenario planning. So if you were to switch 20% of your single passenger vehicle trips to electric buses, what would be the impact? So how can I use that information to then develop clean infrastructure plans and policy interventions that are going to help lead to low carbon cities? So lots of opportunity there. We're already seeing some cities take advantage of this. Dublin has set a target to increase bike trips in their city by a substantial amount using this information. San Jose has set a target to be the first gigawatt city where there's a gigawatt of renewable energy installed on rooftops. And really a lot of opportunities. This is available now in over 3,000 cities worldwide, and we're continuing to expand that. So I think having really robust data is a good way to help drive decarbonization in different sectors.
I should give a shout out to the town of Hanover that has a fantastic committee working with the town manager there. And we actually, pre-COVID, I rolled out my green energy plan with them. And they've got great, and Lebanon too, really good public-private partnerships and a lot of conversation on how they can decarbonize. They're big on carbon fee and dividend. That's a big, my constituents come back to that often. So I don't know in the political climate we're in that is going to go anywhere right now. Our margins are pretty tight, but that comes up frequently.
Sure, Toby?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk a bit about the European perspective. I think, transport, I think, the car sector is pretty much clear. That was different, by the way, 10 years ago. It was unclear what's going to be the situation. A lot of German manufacturers talked about clean diesel being the solution. But now I think with the prices of batteries coming down so much, the cost really coming down so much that it's even eating into the trucking sector, right? I'm pretty, and we're doing some analysis and forecasts on this. I think we can electrify a lot. And that's also really another reason to decarbonize the electricity sector as fast as we can and really, really add more renewables as fast as we can. What's also interesting there is this intermodality. So especially in cities, transport in cities, enable that people can, take the train because then they have a connection. And they're not stranded. I think this is, for me as a European, whenever I'm in the US, in many cities it works, but in others it doesn't really work. You're not connected as here, where you then have a subway system or a tram system that takes you to wherever you want, and then you take your little scooter or something that's there. So I think this is also where digitalization can really help a lot. And then finally, I wanted to say that so we said the transition is much more advanced in the electricity sector, right? And now one of the next ones is transport, and then industry has to follow. Agriculture, I agree, is hard. But what's interesting is how do we manage to get these technologies like wind and solar, which are completely mainstream now? How do we manage to make them mainstream in the first place? And from a finance perspective, from an investor perspective, what really helped in Europe were green public investment banks. So we had the Green Investment Bank in the UK, we had the European Investment Bank, we have the KfW in Germany, and so on. And what they did is they enabled new technologies, new project developers that would not find a bank to invest in their project to get the project off the ground and thereby prove that it works. Because banks do not finance things that do not have track record. And if I don't get financed, I can't build track record, hence I don't get financed. So I'm in this catch-22. And they were able to, help get those guys out of that catch-22 and thereby enable this track record and really be an accelerator of this financial mainstreaming. And I think that might be something interesting. So I would be actually interested whether the political margins allow for a federal green investment bank in the US.
So we do have a loan program office from the Department of Energy that has been, it was extremely in the 2009-10 timeframe, which I think is when it got up and running, was extremely helpful because that was a time of kind of zero capital market access, writ large. And they were able to demonstrate large wind projects, large solar projects, bring them down the risk curve so that they could now largely get financed privately without any help. That office has recently been revamped, new leadership has come in, and a real commitment to get to work. But there are significant state-based green banks that exist in places like New York, Connecticut, and Massachusetts has a different sort of flavor of that. And so there's lots of innovation around financing. And I think that capital sources can be key, especially as you were indicating, the first of a kinds of projects. But I also think that there's a lot of interesting sort of financial innovation around that, including private sources that are willing to take on some of those risks. So it's something that I think going to be continuing to need to watch and make sure we're not getting stymied by some of that. But I think that the capital challenge to me isn't the biggest one right now. It's really getting all the rest of the policies lined up and moving forward.
But what's interesting that the signals get sent to markets, and the change in administration is certainly a critical signal on this issue because, 4 years in the desert without any kind of funding, I bet that program practically closed down at DOE. And now, to get Google and other companies, public-private partnerships, get them behind investing in these new ideas. And I've seen that with the auto industry. I've gone to an international conference several years with the Aspen Institute hosts. We were in Oslo and then Vancouver and then Colorado. And we would have industry there, the world CEO of Volkswagen or, Toyota or some of these big companies. And what they told us, I remember this so distinctly because it was 2017, right after the election. And they said, just give us the signals. Don't, the President Trump was at the time rolling back the auto standards, the fuel emission standards. And they said, no, we're not asking for that. Just tell us the number and we will create the technology to get to that number. And I just think it's really important, right now that we are clear that where we're headed, that this is real, climate change is real, and that we are going to address it and then unleash this incredible innovation and technology. And, Phil, you mentioned the vaccine, but it really is extraordinary. Look where we are, and by the summer term, people in Dartmouth, you won't see masks. We're going to be pretty close to herd immunity here in New Hampshire. People are going to be on vacation and having a great life. And that's innovation. But you have to set the goal and set the standard, and then we'll get there.
And it's government and private sector working together to accomplish something. And doing it, and hopefully doing it on a global basis, which we haven't quite got there yet, but we're moving that way. And so, it's a great sort of learning laboratory potentially for climate change, a tragic one, but potentially a learning laboratory.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point that Annie, Phil, and Toby are making about the importance of clear and consistent policy and the way in which industry can then react to that policy and make the big investment decisions that they have to make either in projects or in innovation. So this has been a great conversation, and we could keep going on and on, but we have this incredibly engaged audience. They have posted more questions than I've ever seen posted in a web conference. We've got 26 questions. And we only have a few minutes. I'm just going to go down the list and we'll see how far we can make it. Okay. So the first question is: data centers are carbon neutral? How? Okay, Marsden, that sounds like a question for you.
Happy to take that. So we've been carbon neutral since 2007. We did that at the time through the purchase of high quality carbon offsets. So we knew, however, at the time that we wanted to find a more methodologically robust way to operate our facilities carbon free. So we began purchasing renewable energy in 2010. So we do the power purchase agreements where we're entering into a contract with a wind farm or a solar facility to purchase 100% of the output of that facility on the grid where our data centers are operating. We scale that up. So since 2017, every year we have matched 100% of our global electricity consumption with renewable energy. But we also know that that's made a tremendous amount of impact and progress. And there's now, I think, 65 gigawatts of wind and solar that's been installed as a result of corporates who are doing these kinds of contracts. But the end goal is to get to zero carbon grids. So our goal that we announced last fall is to physically power in every moment of every day all of our facilities by 2030 with carbon-free resources. So we're at about, if you look at all the hours of the year, we're about 61% carbon-free. 61% of hours are carbon-free, and we need to go to 100%. So we've got a lot of work to do. We're very excited that we are carbon neutral through these other methods, but we really need to get to zero carbon grids and zero carbon supply.
Great, thanks, Marsden. Sophie Edelman asks a question that's very near and dear to my heart. She says, or asks, what are the most important policy changes that need to be enacted at FERC and or the RTOs in order to integrate more renewables and DER? And I'll take a crack at that one. I would say markets and market rules. I'm sounding like Marsden there, but that's very important. I think one of the things you got to get rid of is something known as the minimum offer price rule, which is a rule in the Eastern RTO markets that basically tries to, quote, mitigate different state policies that are viewed as providing impermissible subsidies. I think transmission policy definitely has to be strengthened. I mean, you need lots of regional and interregional lines to bring that renewable energy to the load centers that need it, but you need the transmission to get there. And then I would say continuing to make progress on the FERC orders on energy storage, DER, and I would say interconnection policy. That's probably more than 3, but that would be my short list. Okay, let's go to the next question. This one is from a ringer. It's a guy named Tyler Stuff, Dartmouth grad. He used to work for me at FERC. And he says, and this sounds like a great one actually for Annie and for Phil. Do your preferred policy lists reflect ideal solutions or politically pragmatic solutions?
It's all the art of the
possible. Go first.
It's all about the art of the possible. This isn't time for, dreaming about the ideal. It's like figuring out what works now. The clock is ticking, and we got to move on everything that we possibly can. And that's okay. And that's the give and take of all of the various stakeholders, all the legislature and all the other stakeholders. That's the nature of this process. But that's what this is all about. My
only caveat to that is that I'm watching Speaker Pelosi and this administration bring the American people along, and we are in a very the most challenging environment that I've been in since January 6th and the insurrection, and trying to find a path in a bipartisan way. But having said that, the American people are with us. And I think this is an issue where the American people are with us, and we should continue to hold hearings about electric vehicles and move the American people along and talk publicly. And I hope I know the president, and the vice president was just here talking about moving the country forward. And I think that's important because I think that's where you get this incremental shift with our Republican colleagues, and then we can look for opportunities to work together to get a bill over the finish line.
All right, let's go to the next question. I think it's probably our last question, unfortunately. Jenny Chamberlain asks, she says, it's difficult to work with the idea of neutral when so many policies create subsidies, like vehicle travel over active travel, as well as create disproportionate negative effects on our populations. How do we reconcile the idea of neutral in a way, in a very non-neutral system?
She's saying in terms of something being carbon neutral. Is that what you're saying? I mean, I agree that there are multiple dimensions that you have to weigh these decisions on. And decarbonization is our goal so that we can save our planet for future generations. But there will be various price, availability, access, equity. There are lots of different issues that we take into account to get where we're going.
Well, I want to thank our amazing panel for this discussion today. It was lively, it was engaging, it was fun. And so thank you for sharing your views on energy policies and climate policies that can basically help make this world a better place. I really appreciate your time and your thoughts today. And I want to thank our audience for being so engaged and participating in this discussion.
Great to be with you. This was fun. Thank you, Norm, for keeping us on track. Good to see you, Toby and Marsden, and good luck, Phil. We're here to help.
To you as well. Thanks.
Thanks so much.